Hello, hello, and the topic of today is standard economics, behavioral economics, being right, being wrong, being partial. Here we go. So, obviously, behavioral economics comes in opposition to standard economics. Does that mean that economics is wrong? No, it just means that it is partially correct. It basically says to economists, hey, you're studying this wonderful thing and it's interesting and so on, but when you implement it in the real world, maybe you should take into account some other things. As an analogy, imagine that you study metals and you understand metals and you have a theory of metals and you study metals all the day, and then you come to build a bridge. Perfectly fine, but when you come to do something in the real world, the people who are more applied-minded say, wait. You understand metals very well, but what about the weather? What about vibrations? What about earthquakes? Let's maybe make the picture a bit more complex when it comes to the real world. So this is kind of the conflict between studying something purely as it is, which is perfectly fine always, to when you come to implement it into the world, and then you should say, let me take into account more things. So really what I think is that behavioral economics is asking economists to be more modest. You economists, standard economists, when you study whatever you're studying, perfectly fine. But when you come to apply it to the world, let's just acknowledge that it's more complex than your models and we need to take more things into account. That's basically it. Now let me give you an example, and I'll give two versions of the same example. Supply and demand, an unbelievably important force in economics, central to a lots of ideas. And one of them is to say that when companies compete and consumers supply something, and consumer will basically be price sensitive and they will drive profits down. So the theory, for example, says that if we have two companies that are competing, consumers will look at the differences between them and get the cheapest one. So let's say two companies are offering expensive services. One of them gets a little lower. All the consumers will come here, and then this one will stay with no customers, so it will get lower and lower and lower and lower until profits of margins will be eroded. The idea is that consumer demand will tame the market and businesses would earn very little, if anything. Now, from all the products out there, mostly products try to differentiate themselves. You have this kind of car and this kind of car, and some people like this and some people like this, so there's no real competition. But there are products that are really the same, and maybe the one that is most the same is banks. Really, you might have one bank over another, but is there a real difference? Is anybody really loyal to their banks? No. All banks, wonderful institution, do important work, but all of them are basically the same. There are very few people who say, you know, my personality style fits JP Morgan, and my personality and preferences fit Citibank. So banks are probably the best example for products that are substitutes. Now, according to the economic theory, what should happen to their profits? Be very, very low. They should compete on prices because they're all exchangeable, and people should choose the cheapest one, and therefore their profit margin should be eroded. Now, if you look at profitability of companies, guess which companies almost always are the top earners? Banks. What does this tell us? I think it tells us that this idea that products that are substitute would get consumers to choose based on price, and that price would erode profit, just doesn't seem to hold in the real world. Now, that's just an anecdote. It's not evidence. It's just a thinking exercise. Here's another example from something we call anchoring. So imagine I come to you and I say, this bottle of wine, $100 for it. Too little or too much or just right? And you say whatever you want. And then I come to another version of you and I say, $15 for this bottle of wine. Too little, too much, just right. And you say what you say. One of them you answered about 100, one you answered about 15. And now I say, forget what you said. What would be the most that you would pay for this bottle of wine? And it turns out that people who started thinking about bottle of wine in the range of $100 give a much higher answer, willing to pay more for that bottle of wine, and people who gave an answer in the $15 range give a much lower answer. That means that the first time that we think about the product influences how we think about it later on. It basically says that manufacturer suggested retail price influences our willingness to pay. Now, when you think about supply and demand, people should know what they want and know what they're willing to pay for it. If people don't really know and they're influenced by the manufacturer suggested retail price, what does it say about people's ability to say, oh, this is too expensive? So, there are many other examples like this, but I want to repeat the next point. Is economics wrong? No. Is it perfectly correct? No. Does it need lots of improvement? Yes, especially when it comes to applied problems. And this is actually what I'm worried about. I'm worried that sometimes we over-applied simplistic theories, economics included, to real-world problems. And I'm hoping that as we approach more real-world problems, we will be a bit more modest, take the complexity into account, and hopefully come up with better theories, better descriptions, and better solutions. To all of us, to more reasonable theories. Bye.